James Dang was not the kind of man anyone would suspect of such atrocities. He wore the badge of a law enforcement officer, a symbol of trust and protection, but beneath that facade lay a cunning and dangerous predator. For years, Dang used his position not to uphold the law, but to manipulate it, exploiting his insider knowledge to avoid detection while carrying out a chilling string of crimes that terrorized communities. At first, James appeared to be a dedicated public servant, integrating well into the community. However, in private, he concealed a dark side, carefully planning his actions. Over the span of 10 years, he was involved in a series of heinous crimes, causing significant harm to his victims and their families. His offenses grew more violent, ultimately leading to a series of murders that left law enforcement puzzled and communities in a state of fear and uncertainty. What made James Dang so dangerous was not just the scope of his crimes, but the methodical way he carried them out. He didn't leave anything to chance. He would stalk his victims, learn their routines, and strike when they were most vulnerable. To make matters worse, his career in law enforcement gave him an added layer of protection. He knew how investigations worked and how to cover his tracks. For years, James Dang lived a double life, an officer sworn to serve and protect by day, and a remorseless predator by night. His ability to evade capture for decades was a grim testament to his calculated nature and the limitations of investigative tools available at the time. But as the world would later learn, even the most careful criminal cannot escape justice forever. James Dang operated with a level of precision that made him one of the most elusive criminals of his time. Before every attack, he would spend days, sometimes weeks, stalking his victims. He studied their routines, learning when they were most vulnerable, whether it was late at night when they were alone or during moments when their guard was down. To him, this wasn't just an act of impulse, it was a calculated hunt. Dang's meticulous planning was chilling. He often scoped out neighborhoods, memorized layouts, and identified points of entry into homes. He knew how to avoid detection, wearing gloves to leave no fingerprints, and carefully removing any trace of his presence. In some cases, he would leave behind decoy evidence to mislead investigators, further complicating the search for his identity. His crimes were executed with a disturbing sense of control. Dang would cut phone lines, ensuring his victims couldn't call for help, and he carried tools to force entry if needed. Once inside, he manipulated the environment to keep the situation under his command, leaving his victims paralyzed by fear. What made James Dang particularly terrifying was his ability to blend into the fabric of everyday life. As a former officer, he knew how to behave inconspicuously, avoiding suspicion even in areas where he had previously struck. His extensive knowledge of police procedures allowed him to stay one step ahead, effectively buying himself years of freedom. This methodical approach to his crimes not only delayed his capture, but also created a ripple effect of fear in the communities he targeted. For years, his victims and the people around them lived in a constant state of anxiety, wondering when and where he would strike next. It was this very precision that earned him the grim reputation of being an unstoppable predator, until the day technology and justice finally caught up with him. The search for James Dang stretched across decades, leaving law enforcement frustrated and communities haunted by his crimes. Despite their relentless efforts, investigators were repeatedly stymied by the limitations of technology at the time. DNA analysis, as we know it today, was still in its infancy, and many of the techniques that could have helped identify the perpetrator simply didn't exist. The trail of evidence Dang left behind was maddeningly sparse. He was careful, calculated, and deliberate in his actions, ensuring there were no witnesses and leaving behind only fragments of clues. Detectives sifted through countless reports, eyewitness accounts, and forensic evidence, but every lead seemed to end in a deadlock. For years it felt as though they were chasing a ghost, someone who had mastered the art of disappearing without a trace. In some cases, investigators thought they were close to a breakthrough. Witness sketches, footprints, or vague descriptions would spark hope, only for those leads to fizzle out when no match could be found. Communities grew weary as the case dragged on, and victims were left without closure. The frustration was palpable. Detectives worked tirelessly, but without the advanced tools available today, they were essentially fighting a battle blindfolded. Cases like this underscored the need for progress in forensic science, as it became clear that traditional investigative methods were no match for such a calculated predator. Still, the determination of law enforcement never wavered. They preserved every piece of evidence, knowing that one day, technology might catch up to their ambitions. It was this persistence, paired with the eventual breakthroughs in DNA technology, that would later crack the case wide open and bring the reign of terror to an end. After more than 40 years of uncertainty and frustration, the case of James Dang finally took a dramatic turn in 2018. What had once seemed like an unsolvable mystery was suddenly cracked wide open, thanks to a breakthrough in forensic science, genealogical DNA technology. For decades, investigators had held on to pieces of evidence, unsure how to connect the dots. Traditional DNA testing had failed to provide a match, leaving them with only fragmented clues. But as technology advanced, so too did the tools available to law enforcement. In 2018, a new approach emerged: the use of genealogical DNA databases. This method allowed investigators to trace distant relatives of a DNA sample, giving them a new avenue for uncovering the identity of the perpetrator. By uploading the DNA collected from crime scenes into a public genealogy database, investigators were able to find partial matches. Through these distant family connections, they began to piece together a family tree that eventually led them to James Dang. This was a game-changing moment in the investigation, as it provided the critical link that had been missing for so long. The breakthrough came after years of dead ends, but thanks to these advancements, the police were finally able to track down the man who had eluded capture for over 4 decades. In a dramatic twist of fate, James Dang was arrested in April 2018, in the quiet town where he had lived under an assumed identity. For the victims, their families, and the investigators who had never given up hope, it was a moment of relief and justice. After years of terror, the man responsible for so much pain was finally behind bars. James Dang's capture not only brought an end to his reign of terror, but also marked a pivotal moment in criminal investigations, showing the power of technology in solving even the most cold cases. The long journey to justice for the victims of James Dang culminated in a moment of finality in 2020. After years of being hunted, the man who had terrorized communities and shattered countless lives stood before a court of law. James Dang, now facing the consequences of his decades-long reign of terror, pleaded guilty to a string of heinous crimes, including 13 murders, over 50 sexual assaults, and numerous burglaries. As the court proceedings unfolded, the weight of his actions was clear. The victims, though forever scarred by the horrors Dang had inflicted upon them, finally saw some semblance of justice. In a case that had dragged on for so many years, this moment of accountability was a long-awaited and hard-earned relief for all those affected. In 2020, Dang was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that meant he would never walk free again, never have the chance to hurt another person. This was the final chapter in a case that had once seemed unsolvable, a clear reminder of the unwavering pursuit of justice, no matter how long it took. James Dang's conviction became a symbol of the power of perseverance. Investigators had never given up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It also highlighted the incredible progress of forensic science, specifically in the field of DNA technology. What was once thought impossible, solving decades-old cold cases, had been made possible through innovation and dedication. For the families of the victims and the countless others impacted by Dang's crimes, the guilty plea was not just a legal victory. It was an emotional victory. It marked the end of a chapter in their lives, allowing them to begin healing. Though the scars of the past could never be fully erased, the sense of closure brought by his sentencing helped to restore faith in the justice system and in the enduring power of truth.